series. Today we have the Professor McLaughlin, excuse me, and we are very excited to be able to organize this event today. Unfortunately, we cannot get together, but at Ohio State, we do not stop. We continue to teach, we continue to conduct research, and we continue to produce knowledge. So I'm so glad that we could get together. Before we introduce today's speaker, I'd like to let you know that the Institute for Japanese Studies are going to have the 5 more events this semester, and next semester we are going to have the professionalization event for undergraduate students on how to teach English in Japan. Our graduate students will be the panelists, and the 2 weeks from now, we are going to have the Professor Urike Shede, and she's going to talk about the digital economy, the business invention and the technology leadership in the digital economy. But now we have a wonderful speaker. So the Professor Anne-Marie Davis of the OSU Libraries will introduce the Professor McLaughlin.
So thank you, Professor Yuasa. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Levi McLaughlin. He is the Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University, and he received his PhD from Princeton in 2009 in the Department of Religion. We thought we might see Dr. McLaughlin at OSU last year with the IJS series, but then we experienced the disruptions of the global pandemic. But at that time, he was in fact situated much closer in proximity to OSU because he spent the last semester in the academic year 2019 and 20 as a visiting professor at that so-called school up north that is otherwise known to non-Ohioans as the University of Michigan. With regards to his research, to quote his faculty bio, he is the first non-member, non-Japanese researcher to spend years as a participant observer of Soka Gakkai, a highly influential Buddhist organization that is connected to the relatively influential political party Komeito. He is a prolific writer. He has published over a dozen refereed articles and book chapters, in addition to just as many invited publications, in addition to a co-edited book, and more in English and in Japanese. Last year, his book manuscript, Soka Gakkai's Human Revolution, The Rise of a Mimetic Nation in Modern Japan, was published with the University of Hawaii Press. Most recently, he has written and presented on the religious dimensions of Japan's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. On a personal note, I would add that Dr. McLaughlin is one of the most personable and thoughtful scholars I have the honor to call my virtual friend. And I use the expression virtual because arguably we have a very postmodern relationship in which we have never met in person, but I have had the pleasure to know him for some 15 years, first through a very pleasant phone conversation as he was embarking on his PhD, and more recently through emails and a number of fun exchanges on social media. His presentation today is entitled Discipleship Through Classical Music in a Japanese Religion, Beethoven, Buddhism, and Youth Cultivation in Soka Gakkai. But before we get started, I have a quick logistical note. As Professor McLaughlin presents his lecture, we ask that the participants post your questions and comments in the Zoom Q&A window. After the lecture, I will share the task of moderating the Q&A with Professor Etsuo Yuasa. We will only take comments and questions through chat, and Professor Yuasa and I will take turns posing your questions to Professor McLaughlin one at a time. So without further ado, normally I would say please join me in extending a warm welcome. But I guess we can't see anybody, but I'm sure everyone is excited as I am to welcome our guest lecturer, Dr. Levi McLaughlin.
Wow, thank you so much. What a generous introduction, Emery. And it is really nice to see you. I mean, as virtual as it is. And thank you also, Ezio, and to Stephanie for everyone putting this together. How I wish we could be together in Columbus. But here I am in my messy office in Raleigh, North Carolina. Beautiful day, nonetheless. Here we are. You know, it's feeling anomic. As things grow increasingly dire, as our situation becomes increasingly stressful, I find myself turning more and more to the side of my work that deals with music. There's something about turning to Beethoven, turning to playing, and also reflecting on past times in my own research, going back. And I hope today you'll join me as I indulge a little bit. I'm going to be diving back about 20 years into the beginning of my field work, and diving also into a curious corner of life in Japan, one that might be counterintuitive, but I hope also one that opens avenues of inquiry that go beyond the specifics of this particular case. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint that gets into the topic at hand. Hang on, I need to start up here. I hope that's visible to everybody. I'm going to be speaking about an organization called Soka Gakkai, and I'm going to be speaking about an aspect of it which looms large within the group in Japan, but is often a surprise to the novice observer, and that is the prevalence of Western classical music, of European classical music as a fixture within the group, and very specifically the performance of the music of Ludwig van Beethoven. So this is one indication of it. You know, I was looking for illustrative examples, in other words, nice pictures I could start with, and this came up as one, which is from a recent, actually a call on the part of the Future Division, which is the youth training wing for youth up to 18 years of age in Soka Gakkai to join their division. And it's the event that they chose to essentially advertise that part of Soka Gakkai was a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony by the Hope Orchestra, the Justice Choir, and the Fuji Middle School Choir. So the names themselves also, I think, speak to the aesthetic that I'll be diving into here as we continue. Let me clarify what we're going to be speaking about. We're speaking about an organization that goes by the perhaps unlikely religious name of Value Creation Study Association. Soka Gakkai indeed began not as a religion, but as an educational reform movement. It is, however, today the largest lay Buddhist organization in Japan, arguably also Japan's most successful religious export. There are acclaimed membership of 8.27 million households in Japan. This is something of a magic number. It's held steady for close to 2 decades, and a presence of something like 2 million adherents in 192 countries and territories outside of Japan. So, you know, saying that it's the largest export, religious export from Japan is really saying something if you think about, for example, Zen, other sort of staples of Japanese religion. It is organized, as I argue in my recent-ish book, along the lines of the modern nation state, largely headed up by a president. And in fact, at its head is the honorary president, Ikeda Daisaku. It is understood principally, at least in terms of scholarship, as a lay Buddhist organization. So Soka Gakkai is inheritor of a minority lineage descended from the medieval Buddhist reformer Nichiren. Nichiren held forth that only the Lotus Sutra, the final teachings of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, were an effective means, excuse me, of achieving enlightenment in this, our age, the latter days of the Buddhist Dharma. One minority lineage that stemmed out from Nichiren came to be known as Nichiren Shoshu, or Nichiren True Sect, and converts to that sect in the interwar period included Makiguchi Tsunesaburo and his disciple Tora Josei. They were both school teachers who had moved to Tokyo from northern Japan to take part in the intellectual ferment of the imperial capital. And they ended up essentially combining their intended educational reforms with hardcore adherence to exclusivist Nichiren Buddhist orthodoxy. They were some of very few people who defied the wartime Japanese state, refusing to enshrine talismans from the Grand Shrine at Ise, observing the government mandated protocols of also upholding the imperial ancestress Amaterasu, the sun goddess. And they were willing to go to prison for this. And Makiguchi died of malnutrition in Sugamo prison in Tokyo. After the war, his disciple Toda Josei took the organization that they'd founded, a modest group under their aegis initially called Soka Gakkai, or the Value Creation Education Study Association, and he transformed it into Soka Gakkai, the Value Creation Study Association, moving it very much into a broad-based religious movement. Very much also at the same time keeping education, pedagogy, and a focus on this category of culture at the center of many of the pursuits. Toda Josei passed away in 1958. 2 years later, his disciple, Ikeda Daisaku, became third president of Soka Gakkai, and under his aegis, Soka Gakkai exploded even further within Japan and then started to make really serious inroads overseas as well. It's now a vast institution. It has all kinds of different components, some of which are officially part of the group, others are affiliated, and so it's a very complex administrative picture and a political one too. In Japan, Soka Gakkai is best known perhaps as being the support base for the political party Komeito, which can be translated into English sometimes as translated as Clean Government Party. It is the junior partner in the national coalition supporting the majority Liberal Democratic Party, and it really punches above its weight politically, even though it has a comparatively low number of seats in Japan's national diet. A lot of LDP partner politicians rely on Soka Gakkai voters to keep their seats as well, and there's also a big presence in regional governments across Japan. There's also recent research I've been publishing, others as well, on Soka Gakkai's presence, for example, in business. It is a huge entity with lots of interlocking corporations. It's a huge presence on the bond market. It's a massive presence in terms of education, publishing, whole bunch of other spheres. But despite its breadth and depth, it is unequivocally focused singularly on the authority of Honorary President Ikeda Daisaku, who remains the unmatched authority on all matters for adherents within the group. Novice observers of the group or people who visit Soka Gakkai for the first time might be surprised thinking that, well, here we have a Nichiren Buddhist organization, to see how it manifests institutionally. So if you alight at Shinanomachi Station, which is not far from Shinjuku, the thriving, bustling center of Tokyo, one of the centers of Tokyo. If you get off at Shinanomachi, you can walk into Soka Gakkai's general headquarters, which is a huge complex covering over a square kilometer and some of the most expensive real estate in the world. And it comprises about 130 or so buildings. One of the few, you could say, destinations, one of the places you can enter freely without an appointment, without being a member of Soka Gakkai, is the Mingong Music Museum. Now, this is an independent nonprofit organization that's supported by Soka Gakkai. It puts on, well, until COVID at least, it has put on about 1,300 or so concerts and events, musical and theater events across the country. And it has a really impressive museum on the second floor, which consists largely of historical keyboards, and it runs from claviers and harpsichords up to the modern piano and earlier exponents. As you can see here, there's a uniformed employee playing. They always have fantastically skilled keyboard players who demonstrate these instruments. One of them was owned by one of Beethoven's students, and part of the tour generally is they'll enthuse about the fact that Beethoven's fingerprints may still be on the keyboard. And then it proceeds curiously into a display of clockwork music machines, including the orgel, these massive things that have plates with that pluck out songs, re-engineered in most cases here to pluck out Soka Gakkai anthems. And so you can see there's a real celebration of a particular late romantic aesthetic, a heroism, a real optimism about the possibilities of high culture and its refinements that saw its apex around the time of, say, Beethoven, the end of Beethoven's life, and perhaps a little bit thereafter. So what I'd like to do, if you'll indulge me, is do a bit of a deep dive. I want to think about some driving questions as to why a group that is identified as Buddhist might have such a fixation on European music. And what does it mean to play music within an organization like this? So I've taken up research on Soka Gakkai now for about 20 years. My most profound experience doing this has been as a violinist with Soka Gakkai ensembles. In a previous incarnation, I was trained as a violinist, so this allowed me to take part fully in rehearsals, and the generosity of my Soka Gakkai friends enabled me to take part also in really every aspect of the life of these musical groups. I refer to my Soka Gakkai friends as friends because they're my friends, and I reject the label informant as being disingenuous and cold. I care deeply about them. I am, however, not a member of Soka Gakkai, and so my opinions will be different from those who are. In June of this past year, there was actually all throughout the summer, there was a series of retrospectives issued by Seikyo Shinbun, which is Soka Gakkai's newspaper, basically reflecting on the 60th anniversary of Ikeda Daisaku ascending to the post of third Soka Gakkai president. And I was really struck by one celebration on June the 10th. It was celebrating the commemoration of the Married Women's Division, the Fujimbu, which is really the engine of Soka Gakkai. The Married Women's Division really powers the group. And the newspaper chose to memorialize that moment with this really thoughtful retrospective on Ikeda Daisaku at the piano. So in the 1970s, Ikeda had an open conflict with Nichiren Shoshu, the parent sect of Soka Gakkai at that time, and went through a pretty acrimonious period where he battled with the priesthood about basically the legitimacy of leadership. And in this early conflict, he had to step back for about a year and a bit from direct access to Soka Gakkai's members. And what he chose to do was send out a recording of himself at the piano, pouring out his heart, as he put it, his magokoro, his true heart, in essentially a secret recording he made at Soka University. And that was issued in hundreds of copies of flexi discs. You may recall seeing these things, if you're old enough, in magazines of these sort of flexible one-sided records. And that was sent out. And even now, that period is remembered in Soka Gakkai's official biographies of Ikeda, with shots of Ikeda at the piano. If you go to Soka Gakkai facilities, they will almost always have a piano. Initially, this was set up in case Sensei, as he's known ubiquitously in the group, wanted to sit down and play. And now it really stands in for Ikeda. It kind of symbolizes his presence. And so here's me desperately trying to record via Zoom to take part in a performance that one of the groups that I've been playing with, a Soka Gakkai group, put together and generously asked me to take part in from North Carolina. It is, and here's me, you can see me, I'm sweating like a pig. It's just impossible to try to line yourself up with playing remotely. And that also inspired me to think back onto happier times. But so one of the happier times I want to think about is a rehearsal in the year 2000. And I wanted to use that as sort of a focal point, if you'll allow me, to think about some of these sort of driving questions. For example, some of the basic stuff, like why is the only institution that bears the label museum at Soka Gakkai's headquarters filled with pianos? What happens when you start combining classical music with the pre-existing practices in Buddhism? What does this conflation look like? And how does it work out conceptually and practically? And how specifically, as we're going to learn here, should we understand the figure of Beethoven as a Soka Gakkai sage? And I'm using that word sage very pointedly. I'll explain why in just a few minutes. I'm going to make a deep dive. So I'm looking at a rehearsal in December of 2000. The rehearsals at this point were with a group that I'm going to refer to using the pseudonym, the Tokyo Orchestra. It's a group within the young men's division. Men under the age of 40 are considered young. I'll take it. Within Soka Gakkai, and at this point, a very intensive group. 120 members of the orchestra at this point, including the future division members, about 50 of those kids. And they would meet, the rehearsals would last a very long time, usually from about 1 p.m. till as late as 10 p.m. And sometimes people would join at 9 a.m. and practice till 10 p.m. every Sunday at a rehearsal space owned by Soka Gakkai near Shinjuku, actually. The chanting session, which is practiced throughout Soka Gakkai, is certainly not exclusive to the musicians, but the musicians had a very specific take on it. And so the chant would become inadvertently choral. And so the men would usually coalesce around F above middle C, kind of a na 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 around there, and quite quick and quite percussive even, actually. So it had a very driving feel to it. The boys, the younger kids, would usually meet around A or B flat above the F. So it would create a kind of a dun, 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 dun interval, which sounded, at least to my trained ears, as the plagal cadence that ends the hymns in Christianity. This Amen, la, da, da, da. And it had this ethereal quality. It also tended to vibrate the entire body. If you take part, you resonate with everyone there. And it's this powerful experience, transformative experience. On this particular day, after the chanting session, there was a special event, and that was put on by one of the violinists in the group, whom I'm going to call Mr. Kanmuri, using all pseudonyms for members. And he stood before us ready to speak because we were undertaking this enormous project, essentially the Beethoven Symphony Project, which we were performing all of Beethoven's symphonies in order, one aiming at number 9. At this point, we were rehearsing for number 4. And Mr. Kanmuri was asked to lecture to us because he was a real authority on the music. He had, unlike most of the members of the orchestra who had grown up in Soka Gakkai, he had converted to the group when he was 20 years old. He started playing violin at the age of 30, which is very old for the fiddle. Because he wanted to play with the Tokyo Orchestra, because he knew of its focus specifically on Beethoven, I think of him kind of as a convert both to Soka Gakkai and to Beethoven. He stood before us with a tie pin. He was dressed very nattily. And his tie pin was from the Wilhelm Furtwängler Research Association, which is a group in Tokyo dedicated to the conducting and the compositions of Wilhelm Furtwängler, famously a conductor in Germany who opposed the Nazis, and a favorite also of Ikeda Daisaku's. And so from there, he took us into this tremendous exploration of musicological and ideological aspects of the music that we were learning about. Important ideological deep dives that were available there too. So for example, if you visit the Soka Bunka Center, the Soka Culture Center at the Soka Gakkai headquarters, which is essentially a retrospective on Ikeda Daisaku's biography. One section is dedicated to Ikeda's love of Beethoven, and within that there's a record player and a recording of Furtwängler's recording of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. We began with basically an overview of what Beethoven scholars call Beethoven's heroic decade. So the period in which he wrote the 3rd to the 5th symphonies, along with some other really famous works. And so Kanmuri led us through these really inspiring descriptions of how Beethoven was initially really inspired by Napoleon's arrival in Vienna, and then famously scratched out his dedication to Napoleon when he learned that Napoleon had declared himself emperor. And so you can see that evident here in that this shot of what was initially called the Sinfonia Grande, which became the Third Symphony. He then compared the Second Symphony with the Fourth Symphony, and he led us through this idea that we were moving from darkness, hesitation, ambiguity, to brightness, clarity, reassurance, singularity of purpose. And so he, for example, looked at the opening of the Fourth Symphony, where the basses and the winds begin glowering the depths on a B flat, and the strings come sneaking in with this descending thirds, until finally it realizes itself in an allegro vivace, in a march. And he's saying, this is a realization of the things that he was playing out in the Second Symphony. And then he took us into the Fifth Symphony, which of course is one of the most famous musical openings in history, which everyone knows. But most people don't know that it actually begins on an inhale. It begins with ambiguity. It begins with an eighth note rest. And so he wanted us to linger on that, the fact that there's beginning with not with sound, but with silence. And if you play it, that's what it's like. Conductor lands you on silence. His lectures continued for months, and they were always really intriguing. I think that some of the kids regarded them as this is like, oh, I gotta do more homework. But I was utterly entranced by the imagination that Kanmuri brought to bear, especially when we started moving into some of the explicit difficulties that come with accommodating an exclusivist Nichiren Buddhist outlook with Beethoven's Christianity. I mean, Beethoven was never really a churchgoer. Once he hit adulthood, he could probably be called a deist, but he did write Christian music. And one of the most difficult pieces to accommodate is his Missa Solemnis. It's a Catholic mass. How can we, this is Kanmuri speaking to Soka Gakkai, how can we possibly accommodate this piece of music? And look, by the way, just at the messiness of Beethoven's handwriting. My goodness, can you imagine having to try to transcribe that? I feel so sorry for his brother and his secretaries. But how can we deal with this? And so I was so impressed by the solution that Kanmuri suggested, which was to turn to some of the tenets available within Nichiren Buddhist tradition that draw on earlier teachings in the Lotus Sutra tradition. And so what he suggested is that instead of just dismissing a Christian mass as heterodox, we instead turn to the principle of Ichinen Sanzen, which can be translated as 3,000 worlds within a single thought moment. That is to say that immanent within every state is every other potential state. And so emancipatory truth can be located within blasphemy. And he even led us through ways we might do this. So he took up the final movement, the Agnus Dei of the Missa Solemnis, and he took up the chorus that is sung by the male voices in that piece, the Miserere Nobis, which is translated into Japanese as Ware o Awaremi Tamae. Take pity on us might be a translation of that. But I think in this Buddhist context, have compassion for us might be a more apt rendering into English. And so he saw this as a way to transcend these divisions, and a way to affirm Beethoven's fundamental messages for those Soka Gakkai members who really needed to do this, and they needed to do this for reasons I'm going to just describe. And so he took another term up as well, this very famous term within the Buddhist world of Bonno Soku Buddhai, which it's a difficult thing to translate. Within, or this worldly troubles are as they are Buddhahood. They are enlightenment. And he's actually turned to lectures by Ikeda Daisaku, specifically on the oral transmissions of Nichiren. So Ikeda gave a series of lectures in the 1960s on the oral transmissions, in which he talked about Bono Soku Kanki, which is Kanki is happiness, joy. It's a Buddhist term, joy at realization, but it's also the translation of the Ode to Joy, of Freude, from Schiller's poem, which Beethoven rendered for his Ninth Symphony. All of these combinations were forged in this exposition by Kanmuri, discussed afterwards over too much beer with the other musicians after we had these arduous rehearsals, arguments back and forth, but all these really well-informed arguments based upon a mutual love for the music and a real solidarity that can only really be described if you know what it's like to play music with others. Why Beethoven? So it's actually, in a Japanese context, not at all a surprise that Ikeda would have turned to Beethoven. He's born in 1928, inheritor of this apotheosized figure, Beethoven, as rendered in Japanese scholarship with this curious word Gakusei, which musical sage, could be musical saint, sei, or hijiri, it can be read independently, or shol, depending. Sage, saint, possibly ascetic or ascetic. Nonetheless, the figure of Beethoven actually was initially introduced to Japan in print, and it's his biography, especially in the writings of the French author Romain Rolland, that became extremely popular, first translated in 1913 into Japanese, and thereafter in the 1920s, this massive work, this 13-volume thing by Rolland called Jean-Christophe, which is a lightly fictionalized rendition of Beethoven's life, and his shorter and much more widely read Vie de Beethoven, or The Life of Beethoven, which remains really widely read across Asia, not so commonly read in the English language world, but I think as far as I understand, it's actually standard in China, for example, in middle school, quite popular in Japan still. Very melodramatic stuff. Romain Rolland gets the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1915, and so he has this cachet to his production of Beethoven, his sort of promotion of him as this frustrated genius who realizes greatness despite worldly troubles. And so there's a natural link to be drawn between Beethoven and religion. Beethoven becomes a fixture in Japan. Around the time that Kanmuri was delivering his lectures to us in the turn of the millennium, about 130 independent productions of the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony were put on at the end of the year in Japan. And it's still really, really popular. You can find it, it's ubiquitous. And the Ninth Symphony is a tough lick. It's a tough thing to put on. You need a full choir, and it's a difficult piece of music to play. Nonetheless, there it is all over the country. Soka Gakkai joins this tradition. And Beethoven is vaunted by Ikeda in his writings early on. He's promoted from the 1950s onward, really, by Ikeda. And I think there's also an important thing to observe vis-a-vis Nichiren, which is to say that Nichiren in Japanese, in the Nichiren Shoshu tradition, is referred to as Nichiren Dai Shonin, using the same character for sage that you see in Beethoven. And so it's not too much, I think, to suggest that you can make the leap to blur these apotheosized figures musically, ideologically, even linguistically and morphologically. Ikeda's reverence for the composer was a component in the schism that ended up ultimately splitting apart Soka Gakkai and Nichiren Shoshu, the temple-based parent sect. There was a series of acrimonious missives back and forth between the Shoshu priesthood and the Soka Gakkai leadership. And one of these, in late 1990, accused Ikeda of upholding Christian teachings because Ikeda, a few years earlier, had called for the youth division to perform the Ninth Symphony in the original German. That was the crux of the matter. The fact that they were going to use Schiller's poem was a problem that was cited by the Shoshu priesthood, as they put it, because it has content with deep reverence for the Christian God. It qualifies as what's called gedol, or heterodoxy. There's so many historical ironies, fascinating things that one can point to in this accusation. So when Friedrich Schiller wrote this poem initially in 1785, he was accused of anti-clerical sentiments as well. It was actually thought at the time that his poem was crypto-Freemasonry and was aimed at a revolutionary thought. It was sung to the tune of the Marseillaise, which was the anthem of the French Revolution. German youth took up his poem. It was considered to be a destabilizing element, and he had to adjust it several times because of the censors. Beethoven ended up using it. And I also, just from a religious studies point of view, it's curious to see how the Nichiren Shoshu priesthood thought that, and they specifically cited these parts of the lyrics, that a joy, beautiful spark of God's daughter of Elysium was a Christian referent. There's a lot more one could do with that potentially. Beethoven ends up becoming a part of Soka Gakkai orthodoxy. And so in the youth training that I was really part of, so the thing about spending a long time as observing is that you don't observe after all, you're part of the group. So I am not a member of Soka Gakkai, but I had responsibilities to train the kids, mostly in musical technique and stuff. But so I was also privy to the training that took into account reading. So during some of these reading sessions, the kids in the orchestra were reading Ikeda's speeches, in which he upheld the brotherhood that was promoted by Schiller in the Ode to Joy, and even quoted from Shakespeare and other places, and also mixed this with quotes from the Lotus Sutra and from Nichiren to point at their enemy. After 1991, Nichiren Shoshu gets labeled within Soka Gakkai as Nikkenshu. And so Abe Nikken, who died last year, was the chief abbot of the sect. And so each side of the schism ended up accusing the other of being a cult of personality. Nichiren Shoshu labeled Soka Gakkai Ikeda Kyo, or Ikeda religion. Nonetheless, Beethoven, so rather than dissuading Ikeda and other Gakkai leaders from promoting Beethoven, those remonstrations had the effect of apotheosizing Beethoven even more, and so it becomes part of the routinized training within the organization. However, things are changing. Ikeda Daisaku last appeared before members on May the 13th of 2010. So we are now over a decade into what I think of as a period of liminal leadership. Liminal in the sense of being on the margins, sort of neither here nor there, because in print, Ikeda is a robust presence. There are lots of publications that are attributed to him. There are even interviews with the honorary president that are published in English and in other languages. But he's not there, and also has not weighed in personally on some pretty pivotal moments in Soka Gakkai and also in Kometo's shifts. And this has led to a perceptible disaggregation of the membership into different constituencies. There's certainly a generational gap that's noticeable. And so what I think is really going to be increasingly pronounced is those who came of age during Ikeda's living presence and those who came after him. And there's also what's been noticeable: as Ikeda has receded as a presence, so too has Beethoven. There's been a move away from a focus on the kind of qualitative training that you could see in the Kanmuri lectures toward more quantified goals. Less orchestra, more band. There's been a focus on getting gold medals in national competitions. in being able to score points in routinized exams. This is not exclusive to Soka Gakkai, of course. This kind of rationalizing, this sort of neoliberal turn is available across education and religion generally, and it's certainly very evident in Soka Gakkai. It has also triggered resentment, I've noticed, in some of the musician friends that I've known now for a whole generation, who lament the loss of these chances, the kinds of chances they had access to that let them become profoundly well-versed in not just playing technically well, but the profundity of the repertoire and the ideas that they were immersed in. The Tokyo Orchestra no longer really exists. It was it had two concerts a year. While I was playing with them, when I first started playing with them in the turn of the millennium, now exists in name only. The occasional gathering of some young people who play transcriptions of Soka Gakkai songs. Beethoven remains a staple, as we saw in that opening example of the kids playing the Ninth Symphony, but that's a small vestige of what used to be many thousands even of performers who would come together. Let me round out. I've been yakking for a while. Let me round out with some thoughts of where we might take this inquiry, what kinds of questions it might inspire. I just think there's something to be said about the intrinsic qualities of the transformative rhetorical power of the music itself, that taking the music seriously opens avenues that might otherwise not be open if the inquiry is purely along the notion, the doctrinal or administrative or some other structural lines. It's also important, I think, to observe how ethnography reveals how orthodoxy takes shape. None of this is obvious, and it's hard to know the process unless you're immersed in it, and to see how that which is determined to be the true teachings and that which is determined to be heretical is by no means a natural occurrence, but is a product of very specific social forces. Also, the way that we need to really be ready to break down prevailing categories. That which counts as Buddhism and that which does not count as Buddhism, obviously not clear, right? So within Soka Gakkai, there's absolutely no conflict to be drawn between playing the Beethoven Ninth Symphony and chanting Gongyo. For the musicians I spend time with, these are not separate activities. They are consonant with one another. For Nichiren Shoshu, this was considered to be a destabilizing threat. Religion, therefore, must be also rethought, I think, as a category. What counts and doesn't count as a religious undertaking. We can think also more generally what long-term engagement tells us. I'm starting to feel more and more like I want to delve back further into my too many field notes and too many resources I've gathered to do justice to it. I keep getting lost. The closer something is to you, the more it's become part of your own makeup, the more difficult it is to write about. But now I'm feeling this is a good time as it's so stressed out. Why not delve back into these wonderful, fraught yet wonderful memories? Thank you for indulging me. I really appreciate you listening to this deep dive. Thanks for listening, guys. Appreciate it.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? You can hear me? Okay, so we'll move into the Q&A part of the event today. And just as a reminder, we are asking that our participants post questions and comments in the Zoom Q&A window. And I'm going to share the task of moderating this Q&A with Professor Yuasa. And we'll only take the comments through chat, and Professor Yuasa and I will take turns posing the questions to Professor McLaughlin. So we do have one question already from John I'm afraid I don't know how to pronounce Bunshuk. He asked, were there any musical traditions promoted by Soka Gakkai leadership before Beethoven?
It's a great question. There are, and also during the promotion of Beethoven, many, so Soka Gakkai is probably best known, at least musically, for what I think of its anthems. So I probably hammer this metaphor too much, but what I like to think of the organization as mimetic of the modern nation. So one of the components of a modern nation indeed are sort of songs that bind participants in shared memory. And there's a rich repertoire of Soka Gakkai songs. When the group really first started reformulating in the immediate post-war, some of these songs use wartime marches, military songs. They used the same melodies and rewrote the lyrics. And I had this amazing interview with a veteran male member, this guy who joined up immediately after the war. And he talked to me about how initially, how put off by this he was, because he said it reminded him of his fascist education, like being a middle school student during the war and having to sing these horrible songs. And once again, now I've got to sing the same song, but with different words. And then, but we got over it. He said, I got over it. And then I was leading everyone with a fan, and I was right into it. And but then it starts developing. So you can sort of follow Soka Gakkai history through its songs, actually. And I wish maybe someone should write that article. I don't know, maybe I should write that article. But it's an amazing thing to think about it. And so it changes musically, but there is this real focus on military band music for a few reasons. One is that military band music was an important component of Japanese education. Soka Gakkai remains a gakkai, a study association. It really is modeled on modern schooling. And so you see all of these components of school there. And so to me, it's not a surprise that they would have military bands. And in fact, initially the Young Men's Division Music Corps, which is called now the Ongakutai, which is the music corps, it started as the Gungakutai, so the military band corps. And so now it looks like kind of, oh, that's chillingly militaristic. But no, actually at the time, this was completely ordinary for a school. And still today, band music is the main component, but it's the repertoire of orchestras that Ikeda really promoted. And therefore it was maximally sort of like faithful, you'd say, to play Beethoven as Beethoven was performed originally, not rendered for band or something. And so, yeah, there's a lot to be said about the music and the continued sort of use of songs, which are a component of most meetings as well. People know the songs, they sing them. In fact, that's how they learn a lot of the ideas initially too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question is from the Miss Ann Hildango. So she says, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. I believe that the Soka Gakkai has a significant presence in Brazil. Have the musical practices and the interest in Beethoven moved around the globe?
Yeah. Yes, the short answer is yes. And you'll see orchestras, you'll see choirs, you'll see all kinds of ensembles in Soka Gakkai International. But each place where Soka Gakkai takes shape has its own shape as well. To the extent that one thing that occurs to me now, you'll see international members visiting Japan all the time, and they'll certainly come to the headquarters, and you'll see Japanese members go across the world and meet up with their fellow members. But institutionally and culturally, sometimes they become so different that I don't know if they even see one another. And I've heard this from Japanese members who told me this as well. Brazil has a huge Gakkai population. It's many thousands of members because there's a huge Japanese population. So I think that was the initial move, but actually since then has become very diverse. It's worth also mentioning that in the United States, Soka Gakkai is enormously diverse as well, ethnically. It has the largest percentage of African American members of any Buddhist group, something like a quarter of Soka Gakkai is Black, which is really significant. If you compare that to other convert groups, it's very distinct. This is true also in Brazil. So I understand there's like some Soka Gakkai Samba organizations and all kinds of other stuff like that. It's made itself relevant, in other words, to the places it's been. But yeah, Beethoven's still there. I mean, it's a component. It's kind of this element that gets exported as well. Because also, but Beethoven is everywhere, right? I mean, it's just this, it's a shared language. You can hum the tune to the Ode to Joy and someone's gonna know it, right? And it's funny who will know it. It's just, there's something, I really think there's something intrinsically about the music, which we need to know more about as organisms.
All right, great. I have the next question. It's from Professor Curley, Professor Melissa Curley. She writes, thank you, Levi. That was really wonderful, fascinating work, and very moving to have an opportunity these days to think about people being creative together. I'm interested in the terms you introduced at the end of your talk, intrinsic appeal and social capital. Okay. For me, the social capital attached to European classical music is clear. Can you say a little more about how Soka Gakkai musicians talk about the intrinsic appeal of that music? What does playing that music feel like in the heat or in the body? Oh, in the heart or in the body?
I'm not surprised that Melissa asks the hardest question. Absolutely, yes, absolutely. Let me start with this social capital thing and see if I can get at the intrinsic thing. So what I'm trying to move away from is the mechanic, the sort of utilitarian approach to music. So much of this is influenced by the work of people like Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu wrote a very famous book called Distinction, which talks about essentially what does it mean to be part of the elite, to really belong to power holders in society. And he notices that making money is just not enough. You can be rich, but you can still be marginal, right? You can still be considered low class. Social class is not easily determined purely along the lines of income. You have to have an effortless command of what's called high culture. Things like non-representative art, literature, architecture, the right kinds of clothing. And the cues for this are often really subtle, right? And the cues to the red flags indicating that you don't belong are also subtle. One of the prime indicators of real belonging is love of European classical music. So because it is really only obvious to the initiated, right? It doesn't say anything. I mean, the vocal music has words, but why does it sound that way? Or if you listen to, for example, Beethoven's orchestral pieces outside of the Ninth Symphony, which has a choir, what are we to make of that? How should we explain it, right? You have to develop that in usually outside of the classroom, usually available to you via the corridors of privilege, right? And so it's one of these markers. What Bourdieu didn't realize or didn't spend time on was that those who are marginalized by virtue of not having access to distinction don't sit idle. They create working equivalents of legitimacy granting institutions. They build them themselves and then they gain that legitimacy. This is precisely what Soka Gakkai has done. It's built museums, it's built these training mechanisms for music, it's built its own university in Japan and now in America. It has its own school system, it has this huge publishing enterprise, right? The lectures by Ikeda deal as much with figures like Romain Rolland as they do with Nichiren. So it really is an exercise in belonging legitimately. And as the generations of Soka Gakkai members have developed, they have gained that. They are absolutely sophisticated. They're incredibly sophisticated. The people I've spent, it's like someone like Kanmuri, a convert, you know, lecturing in that way about how you could find themes from the Waldstein Sonata as playing out in the opening of the Fourth Symphony, and how this recording by Furtwängler is maybe better than, I mean, who knows that shit? It's incredible, right? It's in just tremendous sophistication. So but the danger though is that you can just say, well then, okay, people want it because they want to belong. They want power, they want money, they want prestige. And so that's why they're learning music. No, it's too much work. It's too difficult. It's too, and there's something happens to you when you play it. There's something intrinsic, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. And I think the way to get at that is to endure reading and listening to people like me talk about those details. Short of playing it yourself, which is an unreasonable demand, I think it's in the intricacies of the experiences that we can learn about that intrinsic quality. And that the challenging task then is to wed that with all those other elements, the institutional elements, the undeniable social capital elements, because that's absolutely there. It doesn't go away. And I just can't help thinking, and I know this makes me sound potentially dangerously like some kind of essentialist, but there is something about the music that appeals to people, undeniably. There's something that people like to listen to, and you find that across the world, and that always becomes an argument. But well, there should be an intrinsic aspect to all music, and there is, right? But European classical music, I don't think it's popular just because it bears prestige. I think people listen to Beethoven because Beethoven's incredible. And so there's some, and that's what we're trying to get, that's what I'm trying to get at. So I don't have a clear answer on that side yet. I don't know if I will either.
Great, thank you. So fascinating.
Next question is from the Professor Naomi Fukumori at Ohio State. She asked, are there any parallels that can be drawn between the Ikeda's emphasis on musical education and Suzuki Shinichi's of the Suzuki method?
I'm glad you asked. So what's curious to me is that Suzuki is really big in America, right? A lot of kids learn music, at least initially when they're little, via the Suzuki method, and people get trained in it. And I think if you go to Nagoya, where it's based in Japan, it remains really big. I don't know any any kids in Japan who learned via Suzuki. And ironically, perhaps, the real cachet comes from learning via the European, traditional European training, and not through the rote learning that Suzuki promotes. One resonance that I could identify, though, Suzuki Shinichi had a conversion experience. If you read his biography, he talks about how he heard the Mozart clarinet quintet. I think that's the one, or is it the trio? The piano trio. Maybe it's Mozart piano trio. I'll have to dig back, and that's kind of deep cuts right now. He was listening to Mozart and clarinet, and he had this epiphany. And it's in his biography, it really is described in the same way that a Satori moment, for example, for a Zen figure would be described. It's really striking. And it's, in fact, it uses the same kind of vocabulary as that. And so he's driven by a sense of mission. He comes at it, it's not totally out of the blue. He's, comes from an instrument making family. I mean, he's absolutely immersed in early stages of Western or European classical music training for Japan. And so, it's there, but he doesn't narrate it simply in this kind of routine way. It has this moment and then this singularity of purpose. I think there's a resonance there, and interpreting Suzuki religiously would make sense to me. There's a religious quality to Suzuki method, I would say. There's these ranking systems, there's a sense of belonging to this kind of esoteric society. There's a sense of preserving lineage, of revering the founder as kind of this figure who lives on after his death. I think there's a lot going on there. I've actually thought it would be really cool to do more with Suzuki, but I never found any Suzuki players in Japan, so it's kind of intriguing.
Sounds like the potential for another paper.
Yeah, just
the essay after.
Yeah, no, I'd love someone else to write that. Please, someone else write about Suzuki. That'd be awesome.
All right, so we have the next question from John Bunsche again.
Yeah.
Do all of the official Soka Gakkai songs involve references to the Lotus Sutra?
They do not. In fact, quite a few don't. Lotus, and it's decreasingly so. Early on, you'll see Lotus reference quite commonly, often in the title, referring to, for example, the mission of Kolsen Rufu, to widely declare the Dharma, which that's a very general translation of what Kolsen Rufu might mean. But you'll see the Kolfu no, and all these different songs, and they tend to be quite martial. They tend to be very sort of macho, military things, and then it becomes sort of slick, more sort of mellifluous, you could say, after that. And these days there are constantly new songs being written, not so much focus on Lotus, much more focus on dedication to Sensei, to Ikeda Daisaku. I would say that would become the primal focus that you'll see more and more these days.
Thank you. So the next question is from Alan Hilberg. Thank you for fascinating lecture. I recently finished my master's thesis about Soka Gakkai in Europe.
Wow, geez, thanks, dude.
CDI center has the core, but do they only they perform only the standard CZI songs translated to English and Dutch? The differences between Soka Gakkai in Japan and CZI are fascinating. I wonder if European converts to the Nichiren Buddhism can see the appeal of Beethoven and other European high art.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for setting I'm grateful to you. That's very kind. It's very convoluted when this version of Beethoven is returned to the homeland in a sense, right? Or this version of, you could say more broadly, sort of European high art, because Beethoven and other European composers as well, which are also popular in Soka Gakkai, they really have their own career in Japan. I mean, as I mentioned a little bit in the talk, Beethoven develops quite independently over the course of about a century as this figure, Gakusei, as this, a musical sage. And so, and becomes a staple, for example, at the end of the year. I'm sure if you grew up in Japan, you probably saw the Ninth Symphony. I don't want to put you on the spot, Etsuo, but growing up, I don't know if you did you ever go to see the Ninth Symphony performed in Japan when you were a kid or anything, or you're forced to listen to it or something? Because it's everywhere around New Year's, And then you go to Europe, for example, if you go to Germany, or I'm assuming also if you go to the Netherlands, it's kind of seen as old-fashioned, right? It's seen as sort of this kind of hidebound, a little pokey. And there's much more interesting music you could take up, right? Or much more stuff that would click more with the membership. And I think that's what you're perhaps seeing. That being said, there is this appeal to European high culture you can see in European centers, and I'm sure you must know about this, having written about it for your master's thesis. For example, in France and in the UK, I believe also in Germany, there are these castles essentially that were purchased by the organization, where they'll put on, for example, string quartet performances, where lectures on art will be held, things like that. So again, not necessarily front and center. We are talking about Nichiren Buddhism. There's an embrace of this fraught category of culture, right, which remains, I think it's defined variously and necessarily flexibly, because Soka Gakkai is remarkably flexible as it's being exported. Some of the reason for that is accredited to a Nichiren Buddhist tenet, which is known as Zuihō Bini. This was a principle put forward by Nichiren, which is to adjust the teachings to the locale. And so this was put forward in the context of Japan, essentially allowing for preaching the Dharma of the lotus, depending on the situation and the local, for example, adherence to kami worship, the worship of the various deities in Japanese contexts. That has been applied now, latter day, in a Soka Gakkai context to accommodating Soka Gakkai to other places, and in some cases, radically different from what you'll see in Japan.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Isaac Weiner. And he writes, thank you, Levi. It's so great to hear you present on your work. There are folks in music here at OSU who pursue the questions you're raising about intrinsic appeal and inherent value of Western classical music through neuroscience and fMRI scanning.
Yeah.
What happens to people as they listen and play?
Yeah.
As an ethnographer, I wonder what you make of those methods.
Okay. Well, thank you, Isaac. It's lovely. Thank you for joining. I really appreciate it. We are organisms, right? We are biological organisms. Stuff happens in our brains. I think maximizing our inquiry into that is great. I think figuring out what is going on neurologically is a huge contribution. I think it's the beginning of an inquiry and not the end. And I remain perpetually a little dissatisfied by some of the claims made in the neuroscience field, in the sense that this solves the problem. I mean, it lets you know which parts of the brain light up when a ritual is happening, for example, or when you're playing music, or when you're reacting to something you're hearing. And I think most of them will cheerfully admit that they don't know why or what's going on particularly. But also, it doesn't answer some of the questions I raised in this talk, like how can we account for the conflation of Beethoven and Nichiren, right? I'm not sure that neuroscience is going to get us there, or why there's this real appeal to playing music and treating it as a form of practice, or why, for example, that has this inadvertent effect of transforming the chant into a kind of a chorus along the lines of Western classical music. That's one place maybe where you could see which parts of the our neurological framework are combining, and then that would be intriguing. I think though it would be the beginning and not the end of an inquiry. And I think it remains a little meaningless in the absence of ethnography. Like it doesn't answer the so what question about it. And I think that's what we need. Yeah.
Thank you.
So it seems like we are running out of question, but I actually have a question. So can I ask a question?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I love classical music, and here in Columbus too, I go to the Columbus Symphony and so forth. But unfortunately, when I go to the classical music concert, I see that lots of the audience are getting older, and it seems like the classical music hasn't been able to attract the interest of the younger audience. And so my question is, when the maybe popularity of classical music is changing both in the United States and Japan, do you think the Soka Gakkai will continue to play or use the Beethoven, or do you think they are going to switch their focus? Because if that's the case, maybe it was because of the social capital, right, and not because of the intrinsic the appeal. And or if they still continue to use the Beethoven, do you think the I don't know, the status of the Beethoven would change? Like in other words, like they are not using the Beethoven, but then it becomes Beethoven of Soka Gakkai, right? Yeah. So yeah.
These are difficult and important questions, Etsuo. Thank you. You're absolutely right. I mean, every classical musician you'll talk to will tell you that, yeah, it's drying up. COVID has murdered the scene, of course, but even before that, and certainly probably after that, it's difficult to be enthusiastic or confident, to be optimistic about audiences. And yeah, it's especially I find in North America and in Japan too, actually. Yeah, classical music audiences, you think, oh, everyone's ancient, everyone's very old, you know. And so there's a lot going on with that. A lot of it has to do, I think, with the nature of education. It has a lot to do with the rise in digital culture and the fact that some blame can be placed on the world of classical music itself by turning into a museumified phenomenon and not remaining a dynamic place where new music is seen to be like legitimate and exciting. All kinds of stuff happening in that regard, and that's alive and well across the world, and those effects are definitely noticeable in the ensembles that I talked about. So yeah, so for example, the Tokyo Orchestra doesn't exist anymore. So what you talked about in terms of like taking on new forms of musical practice, yeah, those are already happening. So you'll see, for example, rock bands, you'll see hip hop, you'll see electronic music being promoted and celebrated by the groups. Does it bear the same kinds of authority? No, I don't think it does. It has its own authority. It has its own appeals that are mostly invisible to old people, right? And it certainly has a lot of I mean, if you think about, for example, the political impact of the K-pop crowd, right? I mean, there's a lot going on there, which is basically being rendered invisible to the older forces. Will that go away, though? I'm not so confident, because our education system hasn't changed that much, right? And some of that which qualifies as legitimate and that which is sort of falling by the wayside, I mean, it's been routinized, it's been quantified, but nonetheless, those structures are very tenacious, I think. And so I have a hard time imagining that there's going to be an equivalent that will come in, because of just how long lasting and how how without rival this form of high cultural pursuit has been for power holders in Japan, right? And also other parts of the world. But yeah, the future is bleak, right? In terms of the actual performance of it. But I think the future is bleak, to be blunt, for the institution writ large. I think that we are beyond the era of mass movements. We are beyond the era of towering figures. When Ikeda Daisaku passes away, Soka Gakkai will necessarily radically diminish and probably, I mean, schism to some degree. And so many of these training mechanisms, these institutions, it's difficult to see how they can be maintained in the absence of a guiding figure.
So I see another question has come up from Matthew Mitchell. So I'll go ahead and read this. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Could you talk a bit about the place of musical training within the Gakkai training program that you talk about in one of your book chapters? Does musical ability practice have anything to do with placement within the Gakkai hierarchy, for example?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think once upon a time it may have borne more weight than it does now. I think under Ikeda's aegis, because he was so personally fixated on musical excellence, that I think that if you were a superb player, that might have gained you a lot of cachet in his absence, and in the absence, frankly, of that generation. I wonder a lot if that's still the case. And so it was quite telling to notice the administrative shift in the orchestra. So in the robust years when I was first joining them, it was necessary that their appointed administrator from the Shinanomachi headquarters was a musician. It was really important that whoever it was calling the shots and basically ordering people around had was himself a musician. It was going to be a him because it's very, very gender divided. No women are allowed to take on posts in anything other than the young women's or the married women's divisions in Soka Gakkai. Even by Japanese standards, Soka Gakkai is a very gender divided phenomenon. So, but the men were, and so for example, during Kanmuri's lecture period, it's led by someone I call Hata in my publications. He's a really tremendous flautist and a great singer. And so this is one example where Soka Gakkai repertoire can percolate outwards. So we did this incredible concert, actually a couple times, for hospital north of Tokyo for terminal cancer patients. And one of the doctors of the Gakkai members, hey, could you send like maybe a string quartet to play for the folks who are in the ward? And then they brought the whole orchestra and played. And one of the Hata sang with the group as well. So we played some standard repertoire, Beethoven mostly. And then he sang Kawa no Nagare no Yoni, which is a popular song in Japan. It's a beautiful thing. He has this wonderful baritone, fabulous singer. And we also did a Soka Gakkai song. It's very popular with members called Haha, or Mother. And even thinking about it makes me cry. So that was just this incredible experience. Yeah. So yeah, in that regard, there's a kind of an internal politics. There was an internal politics, but I think, and this is what I've heard bemoaned by so many members, is that there's been a routinizing, as Soka Gakkai has been losing members, because every large institution is losing members in Japan. And there's been this real anxiety building up amongst the administrators, and a real sort of circling of the wagons, and a sort of a sense that we really have to protect results, and there's a real results orientation. And now, for example, the nominal existence of the Tokyo Orchestra is headed by a non-musician, but someone who is really good at numbers, who can like chart up results to feed into the bureaucracy and go up the pipeline and report to the powers that be, you know. And so that's clearly where the priorities lie. And so my musician friends, they've all splintered off. They've founded their own ensembles. They've started doing stuff outside the organization. In some cases, it's sort of crypto Soka Gakkai, because it's like all Gakkai stuff and we can play Gakkai songs together. That Zoom thing, I was practicing a Gakkai song. So that's one example, right? But then they're also sort of seeing their mission as being exemplary musicians in non-Gakkai groups and sort of representing Soka Gakkai that way. And so there is almost a musical mission that seems to have developed. So but it's diffusing. It's going in many directions. So they're taking the objectives that Ikeda promoted and turning them into these personal objectives, these personal missions. Yeah, it's a complex picture.
Okay, thank you.
Now we have the another question from Mr. Bancher, and he said, like, you mentioned that the current leaders have not been visible for the past decade, and after his passing, Soka Gakkai may fracture to some extent. Do you know of any movements within the Soka Gakkai leadership to select a new president to prevent this?
That's the $1 million question. That's the $1 million question. The short answer to the last part is no, because there. So to clarify just the administration, Soka Gakkai has a president, the 6th president currently, Harada, who has been there since 2006, and so he's an administrative leader, and very conscientiously kind of rejecting charismatic kinds of rule, I would say. Very careful about that. Ikeda Daisaku has been honorary president after the fracas with the initial sort of mix-up with the Nichiren Shoshu priesthood since 1979. But if that was an attempt to marginalize him, it worked horribly, because it ended up basically apotheosizing him into this elevated figure who no longer had to deal with the day-to-day running of the group, could instead be this inspiring person, this international statesman, essentially. The rumor, there's basically a anti-Soka Gakkai journalism industry in Japan. It's been going for decades. Some of the weekly tabloids or monthly tabloids in some cases, have maintained Soka Gakkai desks at certain points. They're dedicated solely to reporting on the group and mostly rumor mongering about Ikeda. And so there's a lot of stuff out there basically trying to figure out what's going to happen when inevitably, of course, Ikeda Daisaku is officially no longer here. Throughout the last few decades, there have been any sort of hint of a successorship or a bid to be a successor has been pretty steadily squashed. So there have been a few people in the organization who took on a little bit of leadership quality, and most of them ended up being ousted. And so now it's seen as a very dangerous move to presume to the Dharma of Ikeda. And so, but that is precisely, I think, what is going to happen, and inevitably, because Soka Gakkai is not different from other organizations structurally. And this is, anyone who studies religious history will know the story, which is that rival claimants to be the true inheritor of the leader will come forth, and they will be rivals. And this will probably result in a complex picture, at least initially. And then we'll see what happens. This is already starting to play out. The effects of this are already starting to play out in the political realm. So we're seeing, for the first time ever in Soka Gakkai's history, since 2015, members of Soka Gakkai who were being vocal about their opposition to Komeito. This is the party that the religion founded, and it's considered to be just a staple feature of being a member of Soka Gakkai, that you drum up votes for Komeito, that you promote the party, and that you're a reliable sort of support mechanism. After 2015, when Komeito reversed its longstanding pacifist platform to support collective self-defense, to reinterpret the Japanese constitution to allow for members of the self-defense forces to come to the aid of Japan's military allies, the United States, there were protesters outside the National Diet and a few other places who rebuked Komeito. And that has turned into kind of a platform for generally rebuking Soka Gakkai too, rebuking the Soka Gakkai leadership. And so I'm in contact with these members who in many cases have been treated horribly by their fellow members in their local Gakkai communities. They are ostracized for the most part because they're seen as this really, basically the fifth column. They're seen as this destabilizing element, possibly a Communist Party plant. That's been one of the accusations. In most cases, they're just very dispirited members who are opposed to the direction both the party and the religion have gone in, and I think that that's going to really increase soon, potentially.
So I have a question. Mine is very, very basic, I think, kind of an outsider to the disciplines of the practice of the methodology of ethnography. But I'm so fascinated by that methodology, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you got going, how you became integrated in the Soka Gakkai communities, and what, if there are any kind of challenges that poses as being an outsider, choosing not to consider them informants, and then perhaps your friends in the Soka Gakkai reading your material, what kind of response you get in pursuing this relationship over decades. Really fascinates me. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, those points.
It's complicated. There's always complications in research. Even taking up a document is, of course, a politically fraught undertaking. There's nothing neutral about it, right? Offering an opinion about anything is always fraught. But there's the difference, I would argue, between interpreting a historical document and dealing with a living person. Many differences. The most important being that people are fully realized people, and you must have nothing but respect for them. And to do anything otherwise, I think, is mistreatment. And so that's why I won't spend time with people I don't respect. You must respect them, and they have to respect you. Otherwise, you don't learn anything, really. Also, what you're writing is very shallow. It becomes quite untrustworthy, I would say. Through a series of numinous connections, I was invited to play with one of the rehearsals of the orchestra. I was lucky to be invited by a particularly enterprising member who's like, "I want you to come join us. We need to be more, outward looking and not just constantly dealing with ourselves." And so I said, "Okay." I showed up, and that was initially there was people who were like, "Oh, who's this? What's going on?" And because Soka Gakkai, has a very negative reputation in Japan, particularly, and so the members are very cagey necessarily because they're worried about a journalist showing up and writing some kind of really ugly tell-all expose or something like that, and initially, justifiably, they were leery of me. I just kind of was always there, and also I think really importantly, I took the music really, really seriously. And I was really dedicated to playing, and I would do everything. I did everything. I undertook doctrinal training. I did my best, and most people have come around to saying, yeah, okay, it's actually really to our benefit to have a non-member who can talk about stuff, because if I were to convert, there's a member talking about Soka Gakkai, what kind of weight does that bear outside Soka Gakkai? Not really much, actually. It's yet another sort of insider's account. And it's no longer perhaps a secondary source, right? It's a primary source. And so that's one reason. I also think it's very much that is my role. It's become my role, and you grow into it. That doesn't mean that people didn't try to convert me all the time, because they do. So all the time. And that's sort of built into the experience. And there's a practice known inside Soka Gakkai called shakubuku, which can be translated directly in various ways, but one of the translations is to break and convert. It's basically convince someone of their incorrect views by guiding them toward the correct views. And so I'm very much seen as having the incorrect views by some members, but I started to notice actually there too, this because I've just been spending so long with members, that younger folks are much more open on the whole. Some are super shakubuku oriented, but some I consider them to be very, in some cases, deeply enlightened, in the sense that they what you're doing is correct. What you're doing actually is proper practice. this, and there's value to it, and who knows what happens in your life. I'm like, oh, I'm hearing this from a 21-year-old. It's incredible. It's like, that's a very profound insight. So that's part of it. And it's up and down. There were moments where I wasn't allowed to do some stuff. And it was never based on the fact of me not being Japanese. It was always based on the fact of me not being a member. And in fact, it probably would have been a feather in the cap of the organization to have a non-Japanese member demonstrate the international breadth of the group by taking part. But there were a couple, for example, of performances at sites where they said, no, members only. You can't. I'm like, come on. No. Some other stuff like that. But I mean, given that, and given the reputation Soka Gakkai has for being this forbidding, exclusivist, hard sell thing, the people I know, I think it's really important to reinforce this. They are sophisticated, they're intelligent, they are thoughtful, they are various. They are different from one another, in some cases radically different from one another. In other words, they're people.
Right. So as you're talking about the different members, I'm wondering to what extent the vast majority of them are born into the group. I'm sorry, I just really don't know very much about Soka Gakkai at all. So it's a very basic question, probably.
It's not, no, nothing is obvious, right? So yeah, I mean, these days, the vast majority are born into the group. Second, third generation is most common. It's difficult to do survey work. I haven't really done it. And there's the main reason being that if you want to run a survey of any sort with Soka Gakkai, it would be taken in hand by the administration. And then you get results that are basically, that show the group in the light that the administration wants to show it. And I think that they're very leery about that. So it's going to be entirely based on qualitative interactions. But I can tell you that almost everyone I spent time with is now in the fourth generation, younger folks, which really, I mean, that means you've made it, right? You've made it past the living memory of the founders. And certainly the kids coming of age now will come of age, in most cases, never directly having really known Ikeda Daisaku. That's significant. That's a really big difference. There are far fewer of them than there were in previous generations because Soka Gakkai is as subject to demographic collapse as every other part of Japanese society is. And so they're far fewer kids, you know. And that's also one of the ironies of making it, by the way. So Soka Gakkai in the 50s and 60s and the 70s was considered the religion of the poor. It largely attracted disenfranchised people who'd moved into the cities, women, people who were ill, people whose educations had been robbed from them by the war. In other words, the socially marginalized. And so it was denigrated by critics as being this religion of the poor, right? Generations later, it's almost akin to the immigrant phenomenon, where, you know, a generation later, the kids have studied their butts off because my parents have told them they have to succeed, and they've done really well, and they've gotten good jobs. But of course, now they're middle class, and so they're not having large numbers of kids because it's expensive, and they have aspirations for their children to have a high quality education and all the rest of it. So, and also they're not getting married as much because people in Japan aren't getting married that much anymore. Right. So, I mean, all that stuff is firmly in place in Soka Gakkai, right? So they're wrestling with all the same issues. So yeah, it's a generational phenomenon for the most part. And the occasional person converts to.
Very fascinating. I'm so interested. I want to read more about Soka Gakkai now.
Well, I've written a lot, so you can read it.
Okay, yeah. I'll go there first.
Yeah.
So I think we're heading almost at 5 o'clock. So I think we'll go ahead and formally end the discussion, but we have talked about perhaps sticking around, and if anyone would like to talk to you individually, we'll encourage that kind of interaction. But for those of you who have plans and are moving on to other activities this evening, thank you so much for coming. And we can thank Professor McLaughlin like this. I heard this is a Zoom way to applaud for someone. Thank you for coming.
Sincere thanks to everybody for making time. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your wonderful questions. Really informative.
Thank you.